In Pine Hollow, Idaho, the kids used to walk home from church without a second thought. That was just how it was. Quiet streets, porch lights on timers, neighbors who knew your dog's name. But one Sunday afternoon, my daughter didn't come home, and nothing's been the same since. 2 years later, sitting in a rented living room 1,200 miles from home, I opened my laptop and saw something I wasn't supposed to see. But I'll get to that. Before we start, hit subscribe to help uncover stories they tried to bury, and make sure no name stays forgotten. My name is Rachel Warren. I'm 36 years old, born and raised in Idaho, and I've spent most of my life working in church administration. My husband Daniel is 39. He used to run the youth ministry at our local church before everything changed. We lived a life that felt simple, trustworthy. We believed in routines and Sunday potlucks, and that if you did right by people, they'd do right by you. Our daughter Eugene was 11 the last time I saw her. That morning she left the house wearing a pink hoodie I'd given her for her birthday. It had this tiny stitched flower near the shoulder. She liked that detail, said it made her feel grown up but still soft. She was supposed to go to her baptism class that afternoon, just like every Sunday. I still remember how the light looked that day, soft, golden, flickering through the trees like it always did in October. I'd set dinner out to defrost. Daniel was writing up the youth group schedule. Everything was where it should have been. Then it wasn't. When we got the tip, it came from a blocked number. Said a girl matching Eugene's description had been seen at a community event near Bryant Park, in New York. I don't know what made this call feel different, maybe because it didn't come with wild claims or strange demands. It was simple, precise, believable. So we packed up and flew across the country. The Airbnb was small, tidy, a little worn, just off a quiet street near Midtown. Daniel made the call to the police while I pulled up Google Maps on my laptop. I wanted to see the area for myself, get familiar. I zoomed into the block near Bryant Park, dragging the little blue figure down a side street called Mole Street. I don't even know why that street caught my eye. But as I scrolled there they were, a man and a girl, mid-stride, blurry like all the Street View images. But the girl, she had the same pink hoodie, same size, same stance. Even the way her hair fell behind her shoulders looked just like Eugene. I called Daniel over my hand, shaking on the touchpad. We tried to rotate the image, get a better angle, but their faces were blurred out just like always. Still, I couldn't let it go. That hoodie wasn't just familiar, it was hers. Daniel tried to reason with me, said it could be anyone, that this wasn't the first time I'd seen that sweater on a stranger and thought it was her. And he wasn't wrong. Grief does strange things. Makes shadows look like faces. But a mother knows, even when it doesn't make sense to anyone else. We were supposed to go straight to the police station, had an appointment and everything, but as we got near the park, I saw the sign Mole Street, and I turned. Daniel was angry, said we were wasting time, said I could pray from the car. But it wasn't about prayer, not entirely. I had to walk into that church on Mole Street. I had to know why something inside me felt pulled there. He waited outside while I stepped into the cool, dim sanctuary. The place was empty except for a man wiping down the pews. I showed him the blurry image, asked if he'd seen the man or the girl. He said they looked familiar but couldn't be sure. Then 2 ministers walked out from a side room. One of them was Evangelist Matthew, a guest preacher who had once visited our church back in Pine Hollow just a few weeks before Eugene disappeared. He claimed not to recognize me at first, but something in his eyes told me otherwise. That was when I saw a photograph in his breast pocket. The paper was thin, and through the back of it I saw the shape of a young girl. Before I could say a word, he tucked it away. I didn't say anything to Daniel until we got back in the car. He thought I was reaching, that I was spiraling again, but when Matthew walked past our car a few minutes later, that's when it hit me. A scent. Sweet, clean, unmistakable. It was Eugene's perfume, the one I gave her the Christmas before she vanished, the one she wore every day. And that's when I knew something wasn't right, because there's no reason a traveling evangelist should smell like your missing child, not unless he's been near her. Daniel didn't say much as I pulled out of the parking lot. The weight between us was heavy, but not unfamiliar. After 2 years of following leads that went nowhere, we'd gotten used to the silence that followed disappointment. But this time, I didn't feel defeated. Not exactly. The smell in that car, the perfume I'd given Eugene for Christmas, the one she wore every day, I wasn't ready to call it coincidence. Not yet. We were late by the time we reached the police station. An hour past our scheduled meeting with Detective Morris. The officer at the front desk told us he'd already been pulled into another case, said it might be a few hours before he was free again. Daniel nodded politely, thanked him, then turned to me as we stepped outside. He didn't raise his voice, didn't have to. I could feel it in the way he looked at me. This was what happens when we follow instincts instead of plans. I apologized. I meant it. But I wasn't ready to let it go. Daniel suggested grabbing lunch at a diner across the street. I told him I'd rather walk, said I needed to clear my head. He hesitated, then handed me his phone number written on a napkin, even though he knew I had it. "Just text me when you're done," he said. I watched him cross the street, then turned and started walking with no real direction. The city felt loud and unfamiliar. People passed by without noticing me, each of them locked in their own lives, unaware that mine had stopped moving 2 years ago. I pulled out my phone, opened Google Maps, and stared again at the image that had led us here. The girl in the pink hoodie, the man walking beside her. I zoomed in until the pixels blurred together. Something about the man's stance felt familiar, how he held his shoulders the way he walked slightly ahead but turned his head back like he was checking to see if the girl was still following. I was sure it was him. I called Melissa back home. She used to help me manage event bookings at our church in Pine Hollow. She answered on the third ring. "Rachel," she said, "is everything okay?" "Did you find Eugene?" I told her not yet, but I needed her help. I asked her to find everything she could about Evangelist Matthew, the one who had visited our church just before Eugene disappeared. His background, where he trained anything that might not add up. I also asked her about the woman in the wheelchair who was supposedly healed during that visit. Melissa remembered her, said she filled out a visitor card, gave a testimony afterward, promised to look through the records and call me back. I thanked her, then kept walking. I passed a few older buildings, stonework, and old copper gutters that reminded me of the churches back home. One building had a sign posted out front that caught my eye, a Lutheran dormitory. The yard stretched out wide, dotted with trees and a few benches. It seemed quiet, well kept, almost too orderly. I crossed the street and stood at the gate for a moment, not sure what I was looking for. I took out my phone and snapped a photo, figuring I'd look up its history later. That's when a car pulled into the lot. It was the same sedan I'd seen earlier, the one driven by the woman from the evangelist's Airbnb. She wasn't alone. In the front seat next to her was a child, blonde hair pulled back in a neat braid. I ducked behind a hedge and watched. A few minutes later, a woman in a nun-style uniform came out of the building leading a group of children across the yard. Each child was carrying a suitcase. They lined up beside the car, and the woman started helping them load their bags into the trunk. I counted 5 of them. And then I saw her. Shorter hair. Older. But it was Eugene. My daughter. Her face had changed, but not so much that I couldn't recognize it. Her smile was quieter now, not the same carefree grin I used to see when she played outside. But the dimple in her cheek, the way she tilted her head, those things don't change. I stepped out from behind the hedge and called Daniel. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. "It's her," I told him. "It's Eugene. I found her. I shared my location, told him to call the police. Then I hung up. I didn't wait. I ran. The woman saw me coming and started shouting for the children to get into the car. She climbed into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut. The dormitory staff looked confused, unsure if this was part of the plan. I reached the car just as the engine turned over and pounded on the window. Eugene turned. Her eyes met mine. And she said, "Mom, is that you?" Then she looked at the woman and asked, "Did God make my mom alive again?" I pulled the door open, reached in and wrapped my arms around her. I didn't know if I was crying or shaking. Probably both. I whispered, "It's me, sweetheart. I'm here. I've been looking for you every day." The staff member stepped forward asking what was going on. I told her this was my daughter, that she'd been missing from Idaho for 2 years. The woman in the driver's seat froze, hands still on the gear shift. Just then, Daniel's car skidded into the parking lot. He jumped out before the vehicle even came to a full stop. "Eugene," he called out. She looked up, eyes wide. "Dad!" He ran to us, pulled both of us into a hug. His hands were shaking too. "You found her," he whispered. "You actually found her." I looked over his shoulder and saw the woman on her phone. She looked scared now. I had no doubt who she was calling. Daniel walked to the front of the car and slammed his hand against the hood. "Don't move this car," he said loud enough for the staff and the children to hear. Sirens broke through the air not long after. 3 squad cars pulled into the lot. Officers stepped out, weapons drawn, commanding everyone to freeze. Daniel raised his hands, told them who we were. The woman was pulled from the car and questioned separately. The dormitory keeper admitted she was an assistant in Evangelist Matthew's ministry. She said the children were disciples under his care brought in from churches across different states. None of them were biologically his. An officer turned to us and asked if Eugene was our daughter. I said yes. She hadn't left my side since I pulled her out of that car. One of the officers crouched down beside Eugene and asked if she was okay. She nodded. "He told me you were dead," she said quietly. "He showed me your pictures in coffins." My stomach turned. Another officer asked where the evangelist was now. The assistant said he was at the Airbnb resting before his flight out that night. She had been instructed to drive the children to a location near the airport after dropping off his luggage. The police radioed for backup and told us to come with them. Eugene refused to let go of my hand, so they allowed her to ride with us. We were placed in a separate patrol car. I held her the whole way. Daniel rode in silence, one hand on her shoulder. The other children were taken in different cars. The dormitory staff came too, still stunned. When we arrived, more officers were already at the Airbnb. We watched from the back seat as they led him out in handcuffs. Evangelist Matthew, or whatever his name really was. His eyes met mine as they walked him past our vehicle. He didn't look afraid. He looked tired. Something fell from his pocket as they turned him toward the squad car. An officer picked it up. It was a photo of Eugene. Not from the posters. A different one we'd never seen before. There were more pictures behind it, more children. Some I recognized from the dormitory, others I didn't. They took him away. But I knew this wasn't over. There were too many questions still open, too many faces still missing, and too many things that didn't yet make sense. The drive back to the station was quiet except for the soft hum of the engine and the occasional click of the police radio. Eugene sat beside me holding my hand like she wasn't sure I was real. I didn't speak unless she did. I didn't ask questions. I just kept my hand steady in hers, watched the side of her face in the reflection of the window, and tried to match my breathing to hers. At the station, we were ushered into a small family room with couches and a glass panel in the door. An officer offered Eugene a bottle of water and a blanket, which she accepted without a word. She hadn't let go of me since I pulled her out of that car. It wasn't until a female officer entered someone who looked soft-spoken, maybe a mother herself, that Eugene finally agreed to speak. They brought her into a nearby interview room set up for child witnesses. I stayed close, just outside the glass, able to see everything but not hear. Daniel sat beside me. He looked calm on the outside, but I knew better. His leg bounced beneath the table the way it always had during long sermons when he couldn't sit still. When the detective finally came in, he introduced himself as Morris. Mid-50s weathered face, but kind eyes. The kind of man who didn't need to talk much to be listened to. He let Eugene finish her statement before calling us in. We sat across from him, Eugene between us now. He thanked her gently for telling the truth, then looked at us and said, "Your daughter's story matches what we feared." And then he asked if we could go back to the beginning. So I told him. About that Sunday afternoon in Pine Hollow. About the baptism class. About how Eugene was supposed to walk across the street with her friends like they always did, just to the old gazebo where kids waited to be picked up. She never made it home. Eugene lowered her head, then said quietly, "He told me you died. That there'd been a crash and I was the only one left." She didn't cry. She just said it like a fact she'd memorized. He pulled up in a gray car, said he was from the church, that he'd take me somewhere safe. I looked at Daniel. He looked like he'd aged 5 years in that moment. Eugene went on. "He showed me pictures of coffins, said they were yours. There were flowers and everything. He held my hand while I cried." Detective Morris asked what happened next. She told us he drove her to a large house with other children, said they would be her family now, that she was chosen, that her faith was being tested. He made us call him Father Matthew, she said. We didn't go to school. We read from the Bible and watched movies. Some days he was kind. Some days he got very quiet and didn't speak at all. She said he took 1 or 2 of them at a time into a separate room, not to hurt them, not in the way we all feared, but to isolate them, make them dependent, tell them stories, play games, reward silence. Over time, the children began to believe that the outside world wasn't safe, that their parents had either died or given them up. It was a slow, careful unmaking of who they'd been. When Eugene looked at me and said I thought I'd never see you again, I had to force myself not to fall apart. Not in front of her. Not now. When the interview ended, Eugene leaned into me, her voice barely a whisper. "I prayed for you every night. I thought maybe God would let us meet in a dream." I told her she never left mine. That was the truth. Daniel and I stayed in that room for another hour while officers moved in and out. Files were pulled, statements taken, paperwork started to build. While Eugene rested on the couch, I stepped into the hallway and called Melissa. I told her everything had changed, that we had Eugene, that she was safe. Her voice cracked on the other end of the line. But then she paused and said, "Rachel, I found something." She'd looked into Evangelist Matthew like I asked, and it turned out he'd never graduated from any seminary. The credentials he sent before visiting our church had been faked. Melissa had checked his background, and when she searched deeper using his real name, Derek Lanton, she found records. Fraud charges, multiple aliases. Nothing violent on paper, but enough deception to raise flags. She also mentioned that the woman in the wheelchair who claimed to be healed during his visit had never returned to our church, even though she lived locally. And her testimony. It was the only one with no follow-up, no contact information beyond a name that didn't come up in any of our old rosters. I thanked her and hung up. When I walked back into the room, Daniel looked at me. What did she say? I sat down beside him. His name's not Matthew. It's Derek Lanton. He's not a pastor. He never was. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "You were right. About all of it." But I didn't feel vindicated. I felt responsible. I had been the one who helped coordinate his visit to our church. I had arranged the housing, the logistics, even introduced him on stage. I kept thinking of the families he'd passed through before us, how many churches he'd visited, how many children were still waiting. Detective Morris came back in with a stack of reports. He told us Lanton and his assistant, Carla Benson, were being charged with multiple counts of kidnapping fraud and child endangerment. The other children from the dormitory were being placed into protective custody until their identities could be confirmed. Some had already matched missing person reports, others not yet. It would take time. Morris looked at Eugene and said, "You're lucky. You have parents who never gave up." I didn't correct him. I just nodded. Later that afternoon, Pastor Graham showed up at the station. He looked devastated, said he'd come as soon as he heard, apologized over and over again even though I knew he didn't know what Lanton had done. He told us the evening service had been canceled, that they were holding a special prayer gathering for the children instead. He asked if we'd come. Share Eugene's story. I didn't answer right away. I looked at Daniel. He nodded. "We'll be there," I said. Someone needs to say their names out loud. A few minutes later, through the glass wall of the station, we saw them lead Lanton across the lobby in cuffs. His eyes scanned the room but didn't stop on us. He looked vacant, like whatever mask he'd been wearing had finally slipped off. An officer behind him picked up something he'd dropped. It was another photo. Not of Eugene. Another girl. Unknown. Still waiting. I couldn't stop wondering how many more there were, and how many of their mothers were still praying just like I had for something, anything, to bring their children home. The first night back with Eugene, we didn't sleep much. She lay between Daniel and me on the queen-sized bed in the Airbnb, her small frame curled toward my side like she was trying to anchor herself to something that wouldn't vanish. Every so often I'd feel her stir, then settle again, and I'd hold my breath just a little until she was still. Daniel didn't speak much that night. He watched the ceiling eyes open in the dark. I could tell his thoughts were racing in the same quiet panic as mine. We'd found her. She was here. But I kept thinking, what now? What do you do when the thing you've prayed for actually happens, and it comes with more questions than answers? The next morning, we took Eugene to the police station again for a second interview. This time with a child psychologist present. It was all voluntary. They made sure she felt safe, made sure we understood what they were doing. I sat just outside watching through the panel in the door. Daniel stood in the hallway, arms crossed, not speaking. He'd been quieter since the arrest. Not cold, just worn down. The kind of quiet that doesn't come from anger, but from too many emotions pressing down at once. While Eugene was inside, I asked if I could see the files the department had started compiling anything on Derek Lanton or the ministry. Detective Morris let me sit with a copy of the preliminary report. Most of it was what we already knew, or at least suspected: multiple aliases, fabricated credentials, a list of churches he'd visited across several states. But what struck me most wasn't what was in the report. It was what wasn't. There were no real photos of the other children, no full names, no confirmed families, just nicknames scribbled in margins: Mila, Cameron, Beth, and a few vague notes about where they'd been picked up. Some hadn't spoken yet, others only remembered pieces. And it hit me Eugene was one of the lucky ones. She remembered who she was. That afternoon, Daniel took Eugene to a nearby cafe to get lunch and give her a break. I stayed behind at the station, sorting through what we had, trying to make sense of the scattered details. I asked to see the contents of the bag they'd taken from Derek's car. A detective brought it to me in a clear plastic bin, mostly religious texts, a few notebooks, and a folder with travel itineraries. The folder had church letterheads I recognized, names of pastors I'd met, notes in the margins about fruitful visits and promising family dynamics. That's the phrase that stuck with me, promising family dynamics. I read it again and felt a chill crawl up the back of my neck. I remembered hosting him, driving him from the airport, introducing him to the congregation, And now, looking at these papers, I saw how methodical it all was. He'd come to Pine Hollow because we were exactly the kind of place he looked for. Small town. Trusting. God-fearing. And we had a childlike faith that made us easy to deceive. When I looked up, I realized Daniel and Eugene hadn't returned yet. I stepped outside and called his phone. No answer. I tried again. Nothing. Just as I was starting to worry, I saw them walking up the sidewalk, Daniel holding a paper bag, Eugene carrying a bottled juice. She looked tired but calmer. She waved when she saw me, and I waved back. It was only a minute later that I noticed something strange. As they passed a bench near the building, Eugene slowed down. Just a little. Her head turned toward a man sitting there flipping through a newspaper. She didn't stop walking, but I saw her hand tighten on the bottle. I looked at the man. Middle-aged, thin, wearing a faded denim jacket and a red ball cap. He didn't look up, didn't move. But I saw the way Eugene kept glancing over her shoulder even after we stepped back inside. Later, when she went to use the bathroom, I asked Daniel if he'd noticed. He shook his head. Said Eugene hadn't said a word during the walk, just held his hand tighter whenever someone passed too close. I didn't push it. I just made a note of the man's face in my mind. Tired eyes, slight limp in his left leg. A paper folded too neatly to be random. It might have been nothing, but I'd learned to stop dismissing things too quickly. That night, after Eugene fell asleep, I sat at the table with my laptop and went back to the photos. Not just the ones from the case, old ones, too. Birthday parties. Sunday school vacation snapshots. I compared them to the blurry printouts the police had pulled from Derek's belongings. There were pictures of other children, yes, but one photo caught my eye. A group shot in a church parking lot. Nothing remarkable on first glance, just a few kids playing near the edge of the frame. But there in the background, out of focus, was a familiar outline. Not Derek. Not Carla. Someone else. A man in a denim jacket and a red cap. I zoomed in until the pixels gave out. But I knew what I was looking at. The man on the bench. The one from earlier. I saved the photo, added it to the folder, and shut the laptop. I didn't tell Daniel yet. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. But something in my gut had started turning again. That quiet churn of knowing there was more under the surface. More to this network. More names. More children. And someone who had no reason to be at that bench was still watching. Still waiting. I didn't sleep that night. Not more than an hour, maybe 2. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the man from the bench. That red cap, the way he sat too still. The way Eugene glanced over her shoulder like some part of her hadn't left his orbit yet. I kept replaying it in my mind, how she tensed when she passed him, how he didn't look up like he knew better than to draw attention, just a little too calm for a stranger outside a police station. The next morning, while Daniel made breakfast and Eugene curled up with her coloring book, I opened my laptop and brought up the photo again, the one from the church parking lot. It was from nearly 2 years ago, taken during a spring outreach event. The man in the denim jacket wasn't front and center. He was in the background near the edge of the frame, barely visible. But it was the same build, same posture. The cap wasn't red in the photo. It was dark, maybe navy, but the way it sloped on his head was identical. I remembered that day. It was one of the last church events before Eugene disappeared. Evangelist Matthew had preached that morning. The photo had been snapped after service while the children played tag and the adults gathered near the lemonade table. We never noticed the man at the edge of the frame until now. I opened the metadata to check the date, May 4th. Exactly 3 weeks before Eugene vanished. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the screen, trying to make sense of it. If this man had been there back then, what did that mean? Was he part of the ministry? A volunteer? A visitor? Or something else entirely? It was too thin to bring to the police, at least not yet. but I knew it mattered. Later that day, Detective Morris called. He asked if I could come in to review some of the materials they'd pulled from Lanton's devices, emails, scanned letters, newsletters from various churches he'd been in contact with. Daniel offered to stay with Eugene. I took a cab to the precinct. Morris met me in the conference room where someone had laid out a series of printed pages in rows on the table. It was a patchwork correspondence from ministries in Ohio, Arkansas, Missouri, and Nevada. Some of the churches I recognized, others I didn't. He gestured for me to sit. We've narrowed it down to about 6 churches that had similar visits from Lanton under different names, he said. Sometimes he called himself Pastor Eric, sometimes Reverend Paul. Always some variation. Always polished enough to pass a surface check. I read through the letters. The language was familiar. Phrases like spirit-led revival, children's discipleship, special calling. One line caught my attention, a scanned reference letter from a pastor in Kansas vouching for Lanton's ministry with vulnerable youth populations. The signature at the bottom read, Glenn P. Thatcher. I didn't know the name, but something about it felt familiar. I told Morris I'd look into it when I got back. Before I left, he handed me a flash drive. There's one video file on here, he said. We found it on the assistant's tablet buried in a hidden folder. It's not graphic, but we think you should see it. You might recognize the setting. I didn't watch it right away. I walked back to the Airbnb, my mind going in 100 directions. Eugene was lying on the floor when I got in, organizing her markers in neat color gradients. Daniel looked up from the table, eyes tired. I told him I was going to watch something, then slipped into the bedroom and shut the door behind me. The video started in what looked like a small church fellowship hall, linoleum floors. Plastic chairs, a piano pushed to the side. Children sat in a semicircle, maybe 8 of them, all listening intently. The camera was shaky handheld, and then the voice began to speak. Calm, slow, practiced. I didn't need to see the speaker to know it was Lanton. The world forgets you, he was saying, but God remembers. God sees the ones no one else sees. The camera panned, and I froze. There near the center sat Eugene. Her hair was longer than pulled back with a pink barrette. She was watching him closely, her face blank but alert. I watched the rest of the clip in silence. Nothing explicit happened, but the tone was unmistakable. He wasn't preaching. He was indoctrinating. I paused it at the end and stared at the frozen frame. 2 things stood out. One, the wall behind him had a framed bulletin board. On it was a flyer for a summer program. I zoomed in, adjusted the image. It read, Trinity Life Center, Wichita. And below that, in smaller letters, was the name Pastor Glenn P. Thatcher, the same one from the letter. I walked back into the living room and sat beside Daniel. I told him what I'd seen. I watched his face as I spoke. He didn't interrupt. When I was done, he asked if we should show it to the detective. I said yes, but I wanted to do something first. I pulled out my phone and searched for Trinity Life Center in Wichita, Kansas. The website came up right away. Bright colors, smiling families, a calendar full of events. I clicked through the staff page, and there he was. Pastor Glenn Thatcher. Round face, silver-rimmed glasses, white hair combed back. He didn't look threatening, but neither had Lanton. That evening, after Eugene had gone to bed, I sat at the table and drafted an email. I wrote it plainly. I said I was a former church administrator from Pine Hollow, Idaho, that I had recently discovered connections between Derek Lanton, a.k.a. Evangelist Matthew, and Trinity Life Center. I asked if Glenn remembered him. I asked if he'd hosted any summer programs in the last 3 years that included traveling youth ministers. I didn't accuse him. I didn't even imply anything. I just asked. And then I added one final question. Had Glenn ever met a man by the name of Walter Hensley? I didn't tell Daniel about that part. But I had a feeling, just a small one, that the man on the bench, the one from our church photo, might not have been a stranger to Lanton after all. I clicked send, and then I waited. The email sat in my sent folder for 3 days. No reply. Every morning I'd check before I even had my coffee. Nothing. No bounce back, no out of office, just silence. On the 4th day, I called Trinity Life Center directly. A woman answered, cheerful and warm, probably in her 60s. I asked if Pastor Glenn Thatcher was available. She said he was out for the day visiting a sister church across the state line. I thanked her and hung up. That afternoon I got a reply not from Glenn but from a generic church office account. The message was brief. Thank you for your inquiry. Pastor Glenn is currently traveling but will review your questions upon his return. No signature, no name. It didn't sit right with me. Something about the phrasing detached evasive. Daniel said I was reading too much into it. Maybe he was right. But when your child has been taken and returned by nothing short of a miracle, your instincts sharpen in a way you can't explain. You stop waiting for answers. You start finding them yourself. That night, while Daniel took Eugene for a walk down to the corner store, I opened the flash drive again. I rewatched the video this time with the volume lower, catching smaller things I'd missed before. The camera had swung briefly toward the back of the room, just enough to catch the edge of a door left slightly ajar. Behind it, a hallway dimly lit. I paused. The frame leaned in. On the wall behind the door there was a narrow plaque. I couldn't read the text, but I could make out the shape, an old-style wooden dedication plate, like the ones you'd see in older churches, naming donors or founders. It looked out of place, too traditional for a fellowship hall that otherwise seemed modern. I saved the still and started digging. The website for Trinity Life Center listed several buildings on their campus. One was the old chapel built in the 1960s and since converted to multi-purpose ministry use. The other was a retreat center listed under a separate address. The chapel had a photo gallery, only a few images and none recent, but in one of them, behind a group of Sunday school kids, was the same wooden plaque. Same position. Same wall. The video hadn't been shot in a rented room or a travel ministry center. It had been filmed at that church. I sent the still to Detective Morris that evening and told him what I suspected. He called me less than an hour later. That's more than a suspicion, he said. That's a location we can verify. He told me they'd already begun looking into Lanton's travel records. Most were under aliases, but one rental car logged 2 weeks in Kansas the summer Eugene disappeared. It lined up. They were building a case, but it was fragile. Too many churches had no surveillance. Too many records were handwritten or lost. If you're willing, he said, we'd like you to come with us. Not formally. Just to help us understand the space, what fits, what doesn't. I agreed without hesitation. We flew out 2 days later. Daniel stayed in New York with Eugene. She was just starting to rest again, to settle into sleep without needing someone to hold her hand through the night. I didn't want to undo that. I arrived in Wichita just after noon. A local officer picked me up from the airport and brought me to the station where Morris and a small task force were waiting. They briefed me on what they had a list of congregants who'd seen Lanton, a few names of children who may have passed through the program, and a printed map of the Trinity campus. We walked through it slowly. One building stood out immediately, the retreat center. It wasn't listed on their main campus, but it had been used during family discipleship weekends. The flyer in the video mentioned one. The only way to be sure was to see it. We arrived early the next morning. The building was plain from the outside, 2 stories brick with a small gravel lot. The sign out front had been removed. Just bare posts now, like it had been taken down weeks ago. A maintenance man from the church let us in. He said the building hadn't been used in a few months. It smelled musty inside, like old fabric and lingering humidity. As we stepped into the main room, I felt something shift. The layout was nearly identical to the video semicircle chairs stacked along the wall piano tucked into a corner bulletin board, still hung behind where the speaker would have stood. It wasn't identical, but it was close enough. The hallway in the back was narrower than it had looked in the clip. There were 3 doors, 2 to storage rooms, one marked Office. We opened each one carefully. The first two were empty. But the office had furniture, an old desk filing cabinet, a small couch pressed to the wall. On the floor, wedged between the couch cushions, was a small pink plastic barrette. I didn't say anything at first. I just crouched down and picked it up. The snap hinge was rusted, but I recognized it immediately. It was part of a matching set. I had given it to Eugene for Easter a year before she disappeared. Morris took it from me gently, nodding to one of the officers to bag it. They dusted the room for prints, started searching the drawers. One contained hymnals. The other held loose papers, lesson plans mostly, but tucked behind the bottom drawer was a thin photo album. It wasn't labeled. Inside were a dozen photos, children at camps, children in rooms, all of them smiling but not one of them labeled. No dates, no notes, just page after page of nameless memories. We left the building quietly. The maintenance man hadn't said much during the walkthrough. As we stepped outside, I asked if he remembered anyone named Walter Hensley. He blinked, surprised. Then he nodded slowly. Said Walter used to do odd jobs around the campus landscaping light repair. Came and went over the years. Always wore that same red cap, always quiet. When I asked if he was still around, the man shook his head. Not lately, he said. Last I saw him was sometime in the spring. Told me he was headed south. Said he had family in Louisiana. Morris made a note of it. I just stood there staring at the empty space where the sign used to be. It wasn't the worst thing I'd seen that week, but something about it felt like a warning. Like the church wanted to erase that place just as much as they wanted to forget what had happened inside it. On the flight back to New York, I watched the sun go down through the window, wondering how many places like that still existed, unmarked, unchanged, unnoticed. I thought about the barrette. How something so small could survive in silence for 2 years, waiting for the right pair of eyes to find it. I didn't know what we were going to uncover next, but I knew now we weren't just looking at one man's crime. This had roots. And someone else out there still knew the names we hadn't found yet. It was quiet when we got back to New York. That eerie kind of quiet that settles after a stretch of noise and motion and adrenaline. Eugene had taken to sitting by the window with her notebook, not drawing, just staring. She hadn't spoken much since I left for Kansas. Daniel said she'd slept through most nights but started waking up around 5, always asking if the hallway light could stay on. I didn't push her. I just let her sit, and every so often I'd bring her tea or slide a new box of crayons across the table. She'd nod, maybe smile a little, but mostly she kept to herself. I kept waiting for Pastor Glenn Thatcher to respond. He never did. But 3 days after we returned, I got a text, not from him, not from the church, but from an unknown number. It said I can't talk on the phone. Meet me on the west side of Pier 26. Thursday, 10:45 a.m. I'll be wearing a green raincoat. That was it. No name, no context. But I didn't need one. I knew it had to be connected. The location was public, wide open, hard to ambush someone there. I showed the message to Morris. He agreed to have plainclothes officers nearby just in case. Thursday came gray and overcast. I left Daniel with Eugene and took the train down. The pier was mostly empty, just a few joggers and a man fishing over the railing. At exactly 10:45, a figure stepped out from behind one of the concrete columns. Green raincoat, faded jeans, steel gray hair pulled back at the neck. I didn't recognize him right away. But as he got closer, I saw the eyes. Same ones from the church photo. Same shape as the man on the bench outside the station. "Walter," I asked quietly. He nodded, looked around once, then motioned for us to walk. We kept to the edge away from anyone who might overhear. "You're not safe asking questions," he said. "Not around that place. Not around Glenn." I didn't interrupt. I let him speak. He said he used to work maintenance at Trinity on and off for years. Said there were always things that didn't add up. Records going missing, kids who came to stay for programs but never returned, sermons held at odd hours with only select staff invited. I cleaned out one of the basement rooms once, he told me. They'd left behind notebooks, full of kids' drawings, but the pages were dated wrong, years off, like they wanted people to think it happened later. He paused, took a breath. One of the drawings had her name on it. Eugene, in big purple letters. I asked why he never told anyone, why he was just now coming forward. He looked down at the water for a long time before answering. Because I knew Lanton wasn't working alone, he said, and because Glenn kept tabs on anyone who got too curious. He pulled a folded photo from his jacket pocket and handed it to me. It was grainy, printed off a surveillance camera. It showed a group of men standing outside what looked like a loading dock. I recognized Lanton right away, and next to him Pastor Glenn, mid-laugh, holding a clipboard. I flipped it over. Scrawled on the back was a location, Rivergate Storage Unit 114B. Walter said it was just outside Wichita, a warehouse complex used by the church to store overflow supplies, or at least that's what they claimed. He'd seen Lanton go in there more than once alone, sometimes with kids, never with anyone else from the staff. Morris arranged for a warrant the next day. We flew out again, me, Morris, and a second officer. The unit was on the far side of the complex, past rows of rusted metal roll-ups and cracked pavement. The air was dry, heavy. When the officer cut the lock, the door groaned as it lifted. Inside it was dim, the kind of darkness that sinks into your skin. We stepped in slowly. At first all we saw were shelves, boxes, labeled sermons, Bibles, snacks. But behind a false panel at the back, buried beneath what looked like old hymnals, was a second room. This one had no shelves, just a desk, a cot, and a file cabinet. The walls were covered in maps, regional highways, bus routes, state lines, and pinned next to them photos, dozens of them, kids, congregations, summer programs. I found Eugene's face in two, one from the church we'd already seen, the other much earlier. She looked younger, maybe 6. Her eyes were wide, confused, like she didn't understand why she was there. One drawer held ID badges, fake ones, all with different names. Lanton's face on each smiling in that same rehearsed way. But it was the journal that finally pulled the breath from my lungs. Tucked in the bottom drawer, wrapped in plastic. A leather-bound notebook filled with handwriting. Some pages were sermons. Others read like rosters, lists of names, initials, birthdays. Some were marked with red asterisks. Others were crossed out. I flipped to the back. There, in smaller writing, was a single line that made my chest go cold: Eugene Hallbrook, prepared and obedient. Morris took the notebook and stepped outside to call it in. I stayed behind a moment longer, just staring at that line, trying to understand how a human being could ever write that about a child. Back in New York, I sat with Eugene that night while she colored. I asked if she remembered anything about a storage place. She didn't say anything at first. Then she set her crayon down and said softly, "It smelled like burned popcorn." I asked what else she remembered. She thought for a second. There was a room with stars on the ceiling, she said. But they didn't glow. They were stickers. They peeled off when it got hot. I nodded and told her she was safe now, that she never had to go back. She looked at me, then really looked. "He used to say I was chosen," she whispered. "But I didn't want to be chosen." Later that week, Morris called to say the files from the warehouse had been turned over to a federal task force. More names were surfacing. More kids who'd gone missing during ministry retreats, revival camps, discipleship weekends. Not all of them had been found. Some never would be. But the circle was closing. And Glenn Thatcher wasn't going to stay hidden much longer. I didn't know where we'd go from here. But something had shifted. The weight had changed hands, and for the first time in a long while, I wasn't the one carrying it alone. By the time federal agents raided Trinity Life Center, the sanctuary was empty. Not abandoned, just scrubbed. Polished pews, sanitized records, a new assistant pastor standing at the lectern like he'd always been there. They found donation logs, expense reports, guest sermons, everything expected from a well-funded religious institution. But the network beneath it had already started to splinter. 2 arrests came within 48 hours. One was a church bus driver in Tulsa. He'd led family retreats for over a decade. The other was a former deacon from Lubbock, picked up trying to cross into Mexico. Both flipped almost immediately. They named Glenn Thatcher as the coordinator. Said he was the one who organized travel, kept the fake rosters, scheduled drop-offs, pickups. They said he rarely touched anything directly. He didn't need to. He had people who owed him, people who believed in what he was doing. That was the word they used. Believed. Not followed, not feared. Believed. Glenn was picked up in Alabama living under the name Calvin Bray. He'd shaved his beard, lost weight, dyed his hair. They found him in a rented duplex teaching Sunday school under a different denomination. When they arrested him, he didn't resist, just smiled and asked for a lawyer. The media got wind of it within hours. Pastor linked to child trafficking ring arrested in rural Alabama. That's how the headline read. But most outlets dropped the story by the end of the week. There wasn't a single official statement from Trinity. No public apology. No mention of the children. Just a quiet press release saying Pastor Glenn had stepped down due to personal matters. That was it. And when I read it, sitting there at the kitchen table with Eugene's homework still spread out beside me, I didn't feel closure. I felt like we'd just started scratching the surface. The investigation revealed things I still haven't been able to read in full. Details about methods, grooming strategies, logistics, how they moved kids across state lines using church vans marked for charity drives, how they kept them quiet with discipline disguised as scripture-led correction, how some never returned. We were one of the lucky ones. Eugene came back. Broken in places, yes, but she came back. A lot of families didn't get that. I started hearing from them after the news broke. Mothers, mostly. Some fathers. Emails at first, then voicemails. I think my daughter was at one of those camps. I remember that retreat flyer. My son stopped speaking after a mission trip and never said why. Every call pulled something deeper from the pit of my chest. Not because I had answers, but because I'd once been where they were, half in the dark, reaching blindly for a thread that might lead to light. I gave what I could. Descriptions, locations, the name of the federal agent overseeing the case. And sometimes, when it felt right, I just listened. No one else had. Lanton was charged first. The evidence from the storage unit was enough to indict him on 5 counts, 2 for kidnapping, 3 for unlawful transport of a minor. More charges followed once the journals were examined. He pled not guilty. Glenn's case took longer. His legal team dragged it out, challenged the chain of evidence, questioned witness credibility, tried to paint the storage unit as a rogue operation. But the testimonies held. Walter's affidavit, the maintenance man from the Kansas Retreat Center, and eventually 2 survivors from the early 2000s came forward. Their stories matched Eugene's almost exactly, down to the non-glowing stars on the ceiling. Daniel and I testified during pretrial. Eugene didn't come. She wasn't ready, and we didn't ask her to be. I described what we found, how the drawings matched her handwriting, how the beret had been given to her by me, how the timeline of Glenn's sermons placed him within 50 miles of our town the month she disappeared. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was enough for the jury to feel it. That weight, that slow, methodical cruelty hiding in Scripture. Glenn was convicted on 4 federal charges. 2 conspiracy, 1 accessory, 1 transport. He got 35 years without parole. He'll be nearly 100 if he makes it to release. Lanton was sentenced to life. No possibility of parole, no appeal. The judge called it a deliberate faith-based distortion of moral duty. I thought that phrasing was about as close to justice as we were going to get. After the verdict, I stayed in the hallway longer than I needed to. I watched the families trickle out, some hugging, some just quiet. Walter came over and shook my hand. He didn't say much, just looked me in the eyes and nodded, like he understood what it cost to come this far. Daniel put his coat around my shoulders and we walked out into the street. The snow had started falling light at first, just dusting the sidewalk in a way that made the world look softer than it really was. We didn't talk much on the ride home, just listened to the heater rattle and the occasional buzz of Eugene's tablet from the back seat. When we pulled into the driveway, I looked at the porch light. It was still on. We always left it that way even during the day, not for security, for her. So she'd know she was never coming home to darkness again. We stayed in Pine Hollow. There was talk for a while about moving, starting fresh somewhere new, but it never felt right. Not after everything. This was the town where we lost her, yes. But it was also the town where she came home, where her name stayed on bulletin boards and prayer chains long after the news vans left, where the mailbox still creaked the same way it always had, and the wind moved through the trees behind the church in a way that made you stop and listen. Eugene still sleeps with a small nightlight, the soft kind shaped like a bear plugged into the hallway wall just outside her room. We don't talk much about the camps. She asks sometimes little things at the edges of memory. Did I have a dog when I was little? Or did I like peanut butter before questions you'd never think could carry weight? But they do, because they're not just about memory, they're about identity. She's building herself again piece by piece, and we're learning how to be parents again. Carefully, without assuming too much. Daniel kept the porch light on even after the verdict. He says it reminds him that we still have something worth protecting. I think that's true. But I also think it reminds us of the version of her that didn't make it home the time she lost. The parts of childhood no court can restore. Glenn Thatcher died 6 months into his sentence. A stroke. No appeals filed. No last words read aloud. Just a short notice sent to the DOJ and a box of personal effects no one claimed. I didn't feel relief when I heard. Just a kind of stillness. Like a chapter closed itself without waiting for permission. Lanton's still alive. Last I checked, he was in a federal facility in Colorado. I stopped following the details after a while. Not out of forgiveness, just out of necessity. There comes a point when holding on stops being the same thing as honoring what happened. Walter went back to his ranch. He sends a Christmas card every year, always handwritten, always short. Last December, he included a picture, just him and an old barn cat sitting on a porch swing. On the back, he wrote, "You kept your promise. So did I." That's all it said. There are still families waiting, still photos on fridge doors, still cases marked open. I know that pain now, the silence that fills a home when the child's room stays exactly how they left it. I don't know if it ever goes away, but I do believe that when someone breaks the silence, when even one story gets told, it makes space for others to come forward. That matters. That's how you stop the erasing. Some nights, Eugene and I sit on the back steps and watch the fireflies come out. She'll lean her head on my shoulder and ask me questions about when she was little, about the stars, about whether people always know when they're doing something bad. I try to answer as best I can, and when I don't have the right words, I just stay quiet with her. Sometimes that's enough. If this story stayed with you, if it reminded you of someone or helped you remember something that shouldn't have been forgotten, consider sharing it. So no name, no voice, no child ever disappears quietly again.